Right now is probably the worst time I've ever seen if you're thinking about building a PC, specifically due to the GPU shortages. So I decided to build one anyway using modern new components and see how much of a hassle it would be, and that way I can pass along some of the tips that I learned to you guys so you can get your own GPU if you're planning to build a PC. Now, let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Some say every time you smash that like button, you get one part closer to building a PC, but unfortunately it may not be the GPU. So let's talk about building a PC at the end of February 2021. We do these fairly regular updates, and right now is the absolute worst, lowest, whatever word you want to use, it's the worst time to actually build a PC, specifically due to the GPU shortages. Now, believe it or not, some things have actually improved, like we're seeing more CPUs, like the Ryzen 5000, becoming more widely available, so at least it's not double bad like it was before. You had you couldn't find a CPU or GPU, but to compensate on the negative side a little bit, the GPU shortage has gotten even worse. So even in the midst of all this, I decided to build a PC to see, one, is it possible? Can you do it reasonably? And if you can, what methods would you use to find those difficult GPUs? So this is the system that I built. First, let's talk about the components that are actually available. Pretty much it's going to be everything aside from the GPU and maybe a little bit of the CPU depending where you are. The first thing is going to be the case. This is the Deep Cool Macube 110. It's a MATX case. You could either put MATX, which is going to be the smaller motherboard, or a mini ITX. Now, Deep Cool sent me over the case, the power supply, as well as the 240mm AIO for me to do a build and see what I think of them. And all the other components, of course, I got myself. So the case itself, really enjoyable to build in. I think it looks really nice without being too small or too large. I'm actually kind of a fan of smaller cases that are still big enough that you can fit a good amount of hardware in them. Like for example, I recently also did some builds in the Lee Dynamic Mini. Of course, you're going to be a little bit restricted sometimes with what motherboards you can put in, the configurations that you can do, but in my opinion, there have been so many smaller and mini ITX systems coming out that it makes sense to maybe get a mini ITX motherboard, put it in a system like this, and down the road, if you actually want to go into an even smaller case, you can always fit that small motherboard in the case, while if you have a big ATX motherboard, while it may have some more features, you can't fit that in a smaller case, while you could always put the little motherboard in the larger case. And the way that mini ITX motherboards and even MATX motherboards have been going recently, they've had more and more features, great VRM cooling and performance, especially with the newer Ryzen generation. So it's definitely a great thing to be able to have smaller motherboards as well as smaller cases. And of course, to cool the CPU, by the way, is going to be a 5600X, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. It's going to be Deep Cool's 240mm AIO. Now, I was actually surprised at how well this cooled the CPU. I've used AIOs from the EK Waterblock's 240mm AIO to the very popular Kraken X53. I've used those in very small mini ITX cases like the N-Case M1, and I was actually fairly surprised that this Deep Cool AIO did a very good job as well. Definitely something I would consider using in a smaller case. Just have to keep in mind that the CPU cooler block itself does protrude a little bit more than certain ones that are a little bit smaller. So just make sure that you have enough clearance for that block to properly fit, depending on the case that you're using. And then of course, so everything matches, we're using a 650 watt Deep Cool power supply. This should be more than enough to power the RTX 3070 that we're going to be using in here. 650 watts is going to be more than enough to power an RTX 3070. In fact, some people have even done 3080s and 3090s on similar power supplies, so the 3070 should be more than fine. Now, all the other components in the system, like I'm using an Asus Mini ITX motherboard. Generally, you'll have two really good ones to choose from, the B550i or the X570i. They're very, very similar in some ways. The B550i may even be a little bit better since it has a USB-C connection for your header, and it's actually a little bit newer than the X570, but technically the X570 is the little bit higher end motherboard. I've also used the Impact Asus motherboard before, but that one is certainly much more of a premium, and I think for most builds it's not going to be too necessary. So let's talk about some of the components that are very difficult to get and the ways ways that I got them and methods you could also follow in order to get them. So first, let's talk about the little bit easier of the two, and that's going to be the CPU. We're running the Ryzen 5600X, which at $299 actually presents itself to be a pretty nice value for a very high performing gaming CPU. It doesn't really run particularly hot like some of the other higher end SKUs, like maybe the 5800X or something like that. Since it's 8 core, it's going to run a little hotter. So that means this is a little bit easier to cool. But of course, with a 240mm AIO, it's going to be pretty much overkill for a CPU like this, which does come with an included heatsink if you want to use that stock solution instead of getting like an aftermarket AIO like I've done here. But I prefer the look and the extra performance of an AIO, because even on a chip like this, at times, if you're pushing it, it certainly can make a difference. So where can you get a 5600X? Well, good news is that in the last few weeks, stock and availability has actually improved somewhat for the Ryzen 5000 CPUs. Not only in local stores like Micro Center, basically the 5600 and 5800X are going to be the ones most widely available. If you're looking for a 5900 or a 5950X, those two continue to be very, very difficult. But in the scope of this video and of the build, I would recommend you stick with either the 5600 or 5800X. Maybe the 5600X is a little bit easier to cool for the most part, but both are going to be very high performing. And even online, if you look at Newegg and Amazon, there have been more and more restocking of these particular two CPUs, where I think it's certainly a little bit easier for most people to get them. Now, even places that were selling them for more than MSRP, or even local scalpers or something like that, if you take a look at those prices, those have also come down substantially. The prices are pretty much at MSRP or very close to MSRP for these two processors. So certainly I think you should have a fairly decent time if you try, during the next few days or whatever. You can definitely get these two CPUs. I would try all of the main retailers. They have been restocking the 5600X, the 5800X fairly frequently, and like I mentioned, if you have a local Micro Center, they seem to have them in stock now. Stores seem to have 25 plus of each, so that means certainly a pretty large amount. So after we've gotten the CPU out of the way, that leaves us to the most difficult part, and that's the GPU. This is pretty much where my suggestion for you to not build a PC right now is going to hinder. It's basically on that GPU, and this is a major problem for various reasons. First, all of the new GPUs are perpetually sold out. When they come in stock, it's literally for seconds. You have to use some type of like a bot notification or something like that. If you miss it, your only other chance is to pay a scalper. But even that has been less and less available on the market. I searched my local Facebook marketplace, even on eBay. There are many, many less copies of GPUs for sale than there was even a few months ago. Basically, even the really expensive scalper GPUs have pretty much disappeared, and the ones that are left are priced outrageously high. We're talking about over $1,000 for like 3060s and 3070s. They're all extremely high prices. So this 3070, this is the Suprim MSI GPU. It's pretty much one of the more expensive and high-end 3070 GPUs that you can get, along with the Asus Strix and some like that. So the MSI Suprim GPU. First, it's a great GPU, excellent build quality, the cooler's very quiet, performs great. I was able to get this one on Newegg for the MSRP of $800. Now it's already up, I think, to $829 or $859 for the Suprim X variant. So you're going to be paying over $800 for a 3070 MSRP if you have any chance at getting one. So how was I able to do it? Well, if you follow certain bot notifications, like on Twitter, there's a stock alert bot that they'll tell you that something's in stock. I just happened to get that alert. I went right away to my Newegg app. I opened it up. I had Apple Pay ready. I checked out and I was able to get one. Now, mind you, this was after, I failed at doing this probably at least 5 or 6 times. Most of the time it showed out of stock. So I was very surprised to be able to actually find it in stock. Part of the reason most likely was that this 3070 is going to be one of the more expensive ones. You can find 3070s all the way down to $650 to $500 something. Remember, the MSRP was $499. Now this one at $800, I'm sure a lot of people saw it and they were like a little bit hesitant to pay that much for a GPU, but unfortunately we're well past optimal situations and you're going to be overpaying for basically any GPU that you get now. So as frustrating as the lack of stock is, the suggestion can also be a little frustrating to just try these notifications. They have Discord servers, they have various ways for you to be notified of a GPU, but right now that's the only way that you're going to get one. You have to be up on these notifications because you're not going to randomly check anywhere. These GPUs disappear very, very quickly. Of course, if you have a local Micro Center, like I always say, you can always go and try to, wait in line early in the morning. They get regular shipments in, probably a little less recently, but they generally do get them. But these stock notifications are going to be the best way to get a GPU. And don't even look at the secondhand market. Everything from 1080s and 1080 Ti's are absolutely through the roof. Not to mention the newer GPUs like a 3080. You're going to be paying in some cases over $1,500, over $2,000 for a lot of 3090s. So the newer GPUs are understandably very expensive, but be careful out there, especially in the secondhand market, because all of the old stuff, even like 1660 Ti's, are considerably more expensive now. You're going to pay hundreds of dollars more for something like that. That's why, even though I built this PC now, it's because I really tried to get these GPUs. I use all these different methods, but in general, I would recommend against it because first, you're definitely going to overpay. I think it's just better to wait it out a little bit. Unfortunately, that's the reality of the situation, or at least get all your other components ready and keep looking for that GPU. Keep doing these stock notifications. You're going to have to view it like a game. And remember, when you find a GPU, most likely you should just get it if you really need it because prices don't seem like they're going to be going down anytime soon. So I hope you guys enjoyed some of these tips as well as this build. So I did enjoy building in the case. The system is performing great. I have the 2 fans on the front as well as the fans on top and on the rear. That way it gives me some pretty nice airflow. Of course, you have these little air rivets on the side. It'd be nice too in the future if there's a version of this case with a mesh panel. I think that will give you even better airflow, but aesthetically, I really enjoy the case. I'm really liking these smaller cases. It's much easier to move around, even sometimes easier to do a nice clean build in. All right, guys, so let me know if you have any questions down below. Happy GPU hunting out there, and I'll see you guys on the next video.